Great talks. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Alice Kelley and Bonnie Newsom to speak. I've been looking forward to hearing them talk about this work for some time. And all I want to do is exemplify a little bit what I said before about interdisciplinary things, stakeholder things, and solutions. Alice, one of the things, I know a few things that she does, but one of the things she does is she does geoarchaeology, kind of how humans deal with and are influenced by landscapes and environmental factors. And she's an instructor in the School of Earth and Climate Sciences. And then Bonnie is an assistant professor in anthropology, and she calls herself an indigenous archaeologist. And what I found interesting is, under some of the things she says, through my research, I seek to humanize people in the past by exploring concepts of identity, style, social boundaries, and human agency. Those two pieces of the puzzle are really important, but they don't always get connected. So it's really wonderful that these two women have decided to work together. And again, I often don't know very much about these talks, which is why I come every week. But it seems to me that the thing that they're going to talk about, which is the fact that there are these coastal middens that you'll hear all about, that sit right at the edge of the sea, and don't know if everybody realizes this, but sea level's going up relentlessly, that this is a kind of a complex challenge, right? We have coupled systems. We have interactions, reciprocal interactions between people and nature. So you need the people who think about the people and the nature, and you need them to be talking with each other about how the system works. And I just got off the phone with a very close colleague in the Penobscot Nation who called me about something, and who I've always found helpful to hear his thinking about what he calls Western science and indigenous knowledge and how we bring those together. So this is going to be an example of that too. But remember my thing, if you walk in the front door, it says the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. What on earth does it look like to have a solution to a problem as inexorable as sea level rise? Right? The title of their talk is Racing the Clock. Well, the clock isn't going to stop ticking here, right? So these guys are doing the really important work of what does it even mean to think about solutions in a space like this. And this is just one of countless examples, right, of the kind of problems we're going to have to cope with going forward. So I think Alice and Bonnie represent the best of this kind of work, but thankfully there are many people working on many problems like this. And I think one of the fun things that I enjoy about coming each week, even when the topics and the speakers and the partners differ completely, is we're all trying to get to a similar goal of a better world where we kind of have humans and nature finding a way to work okay together. It might not be great all the time based on some of the things in the mix so far. So I'm going to hand it over to them, but I'm going to do it by trying to help switch talks if I can. And that's you guys, so I can go here. And please join me in welcoming Alice and Bonnie.
Well, hi. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm looking forward to telling you about our project. I'm going to start off and then I'll hand off to Bonnie. And as I was listening to David's introduction, I realized that he either set me up very well for the introduction I was going to give, or he took part of it. So we'll go from there. But the idea is that, of course, here we are, the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, and this problem of racing the clock against sea level rise does not have a fix. We can't fix this problem. And so what we've chosen to do in our project is to put together a group of stakeholders to work together with them, not just include their ideas, but work with them to develop and document what's going on at the coast, to develop strategies to approach those problems, and then also to create some information that can be used by cultural resource managers in the future. And so, racing the clock to preserve the past. We're going to lay the groundwork for what we're doing, tell you a little bit about the history, and then go into the project itself. So, see if I can. So, when we think about preserving the past, this is frequently what most people's view of cultural preservation is. We're looking at historic buildings like the Blaine House, the governor's home in Augusta, historic forts, churches and meeting houses, and especially lighthouses. People just love lighthouses. And this is important to preserve this part of our past. This is a shared history of the experience of the people in Maine. And it attracts a lot of attention. And it also attracts a lot of money, hundreds to thousands to millions of dollars when you're talking about moving lighthouses on the coast. But yet, while this is important, there are other things that seem to lag a little bit in attention. And for us, that's the coastal shell middens of Maine. This is a picture of one on the mid-coast. I think you can see the very steep bluff on the front, the white, oops, I pushed the wrong button. The white that you see along the foot of the bluff is eroded shells. These are bits of clam shells. So we have over 2,000 or approximately 2,000 of these features on Maine's coast and coastal islands. Together they represent over 4,000 years of cultural heritage for Maine and for its people. It also provides a great deal of paleoenvironmental information, which Bonnie will talk about in a bit. And as a result of sea level rise, these features are being lost to the sea, little by little every day, and large piece by large piece after coastal storms. And so sea level rise is relentless against these, and climate change is also impacting them as well. So what are coastal shell middens? Well, coastal shell middens are sometimes called shell heaps or shell mounds, and they're human-generated accumulations of shells. On the Maine coast, most of these are clam shells. In some very special areas, like the Damascotta area, they're composed largely of oyster shells. And as you can see in the image to the right, they're frequently stratified. This is one with a lot of thick shell layers. Sometimes the shell is mixed with soil. Sometimes it's a lot of soil with just a little bit of shell. And then occasionally they're associated with these very thick organic layers. You can see a black one there. If I could make this, I was told how to use.
At the top, like at 12 o'clock, there's a little arrow in there.
Okay, so here you can see a black line. These are thick accumulations of organic material, perhaps from occupation, or also perhaps from soils that were forming in times of abandonment. But in all of these sites, regardless of their size or whatever, they can hold a lot of important information. They may contain artifacts, but they also contain faunal material, floral remains, and all of these things give us a great idea about the conditions in the Gulf of Maine at the time they were deposited. As I said, there are over 2,000 of these features on the Maine coast, and they come in a variety of sizes and settings. The largest and probably best known is the Maine Midden in Damascotta. It's the largest shell midden north of Georgia. It's composed almost entirely of oyster shells. It's flanked on the other side of the river by a midden that is no longer there, but the whaleback midden, and then a large number of smaller associated middens. So there we go from the biggest to perhaps one of the smallest, which is one on the right-hand side, found in Sips Bay in Washington County. This is a very small midden. We may be seeing only the last remaining part of what was once a much larger feature. Every one that we know about are actively eroding, and we have some records that some have already disappeared. Things that were described 20 or 30 years ago, when you go to that spot, there are only a few shells and maybe not even that. In speaking with a colleague at the Museum of Civilization in Canada, we were talking about some of his work and the South Shore of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the Maritimes, and they have virtually all of their shell middens are gone. They have just little remnants here and there. So they are experiencing what we will be facing in the future. So if we look at these shell middens and that they are composed of human-generated material, we're looking at a human coastal story that is intimately tied to the sea level history of Maine. So this is a relative sea level curve for the coast of Maine. It shows the location of the shoreline with respect to land elevation through time since the last glaciation. This was developed by Joe Kelley and Dan Belknap. The Kelley et al. There is the other Kelley, not me, who developed this by looking at a whole series of markers of sea level change and tying those with dates. So we can go back to the earliest time when Maine had a coast as the ice was pulling back. And so at that point, we had isostatic adjustment of or depression of the landscape. The land was pushed down by the great weight of the ice. So sea level was quite high against that. So we were at about, the coastline stood at 80 meters above present sea level. So that took sea level all the way into Millinocket and the Penobscot drainage. If we go to that time period, we can see that there are still some relative ice caps here and there. The ice sheet is pulling back from Maine. Much of the coast of Maine is inundated, and the landscape facing people who are coming into this area following the ice may have looked somewhat like this. Sea level was falling rapidly, perhaps leaving areas that would look like this beach system here in Alaska. Undoubtedly, people were using coastal resources, but we have no record of that. It is sea level may have been changing so rapidly that we weren't seeing accumulations of occupations, or they may be somewhere under trees in the woods of Maine where we're not seeing that kind of coastal occupation. So if we continue along through the history of the coast in Maine, sea level fell along the Maine coast until we got to a time at about 12,000 years ago, where sea level reached a low stand, what is referred to as a low stand, about 60 meters below current present, meaning that every area from our current coastline far to 60 meters water depth at present was open land available for people to use. Now again, we have this is a submerged area. We have no record of this because right after 12,000 years ago, rising sea level outpaced the isostatic adjustment of the Earth's crust, and sea level began to rise rapidly. At that time, the coast may have looked something like this. This is present-day Greenland. Vegetation would have been tundra and open parkland. Certainly coastal resources in the form of mammals and birds and fish and shellfish, but again, no record. If we go to approximately 8,000 years ago, we begin to see a record of human occupation of this submerged area. And it's as a result of artifacts that are happenstance catches in draggers' nets. Bits and pieces. We have a chipped stone tool here, ground stone tool, and if we look at these, the time period is somewhere around 8,000 years ago. In 2009, 2010, Joe Kelley worked with another archaeologist colleague, Stephen Clayson, on a NOAA Explore grant to look at an area that had hosted some of these features and did work to allow them to look at the stratigraphy as well as the submerged landscape. And what they found were that these artifacts were associated with a landscape that held a freshwater lake, a beach, a marsh, and probably looked very much like this modern day setting here. So this is our first real record of people living in this submerged region. No shell middens. I would suspect that they are there, but through erosion and being covered by material, we don't see them. This is certainly an area for research in the future. Which brings us to the present, and this is what we have left. We're looking at about 4,000 years of coastal occupation, people living on the coast, hunting, fishing, gathering shellfish, and those middens are visible on the coast and they are currently eroding. When you see these large white areas along the front of a beach, and here, those are shells that are being actively eroded out of that coastal site. Now, this idea of coastal erosion in archaeological sites is not particularly new. In the late 1800s, Matthews, working at the mouth of the St. Croix River, was investigating an indigenous settlement called the Dept, and what he noted as he was looking at house rings or occupation sites, house sites, was that some seemed to be just at the very edge of the bluff or at the beach. And as he looked at sequentially younger occupations, they were farther and farther away from that coast. People were responding to sea level change 3,000 years ago. They were living with sea level change and making adjustments to that. Perhaps this is something that we could be learning from in our current problems with sea level.
So I'm going to pick up where Alice left off and talk about coastal shell middens, sometimes, as she said, referred to as heaps or mounds. These are human-generated features on the landscape. People would collect shells or clams, use the shells, eat the shells, maybe use them for bait, and then dump the shells in sometimes really large mounds and sometimes small mounds. But they generally date from roughly 5,000 years ago to the contact period. And they're awesome because they contain this cultural and paleoenvironmental record that spans millennia. And there's really very few places where you can actually get that kind of record. I want to point out, too, that they're one of Maine's most fragile cultural resources, right? Once these are gone, they're actually gone for good. And so in terms of thinking about shell middens and archaeological sites as being non-renewable, that's very real. And what happens is that when we lose them, we lose the record of indigenous lifeways and non-indigenous lifeways. We know that from our research that people living in Maine lived in a hunting and fishing and gathering kind of economy, and they were quite sustainable in how they behaved. And part of that is because of their relationship not only with the land and other species, but how they their relationship to material culture is very different from what we have today. People or there's clams they help to preserve things in the archaeological record. Maine soils are very acidic, and and the shells help to reduce that acidity. And so when that happens, we get all this really great preservation. So exceptional preservation equals really varied and exceptional data sets. And so here you can see some of the examples of some of the things that shell middens help to preserve. past plant remains, so we can get a sense of not only what people were eating, but perhaps what they were using for medicines as well. We can get shells can help to tell us about season of occupation. We can also see shell size change over time, which is important in terms of understanding ecosystems and the lifespans of shellfish. We can get, that's a cod vertebra, we can get fish bone, and you'd be amazed at the difference in sizes, or probably you wouldn't be amazed in the difference in sizes in fish from between then and today. Archaeologists are commonly known for their interest in material culture, and we see a variety of things here. Let me see if I can figure out this artifact. Oh, nope.
Just hit the bottom one.
The top circle, the 12 o'clock on the top circle, but
Hit the
now we
bottom
gotta get
button.
you that.
Okay. Wrong one. Okay. See, I'm not into modern technology because I'm an archaeologist, right? But here you can see some of the material culture that these sites preserve. This is a bone tool. These are Aboriginal ceramics. People made ceramics here in Maine from about 3,000 years ago to the contact period. Of course, arrowheads or spear points, those are pretty common. And here in Maine, we do have some contact period sites and post-colonial sites, and I'll talk a little bit about those. That's a piece of a doll. We also get what archaeologists refer to as cultural features, and features are anything that's in the archaeological record that if you move it, you destroy it. So something like a fire hearth or a house floor, you can't pick it up and take it to the lab. And so here, this is at Holmes Point West in Machias. This is a standing stone that the crew encountered while doing excavations. Not sure what it was used for. I've seen one similar to this in the Howland area, maybe a territory marker. We're unsure, but it's these things that these data sets that we're losing in terms of coastal erosion and erosion of the shell midden sites. So in addition to kind of those things, we also get this great paleoenvironmental record, right? And so we have really unique preservation here. So we get things like this is faunal or bone material from an archaeological site. We can tell what people were taking for food, how they were reusing some of these materials, and for things like bone tools. What's really neat about the shell middens here in Maine is that they preserve extinct species or evidence of extinct species. We can't get to these guys any other way, right? But this sea mink is no longer with us. But evidence and remnants of sea mink can be found in archaeological sites. The great auk is another one. Swordfish was in Maine roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, indicating that the sea waters were warmer. We know that people were taking swordfish, which is an interesting story in and of itself. If you've ever seen anybody do any sword fishing, it's quite a feat. So we know that they had some sort of boat technology, right? And so all of this information is captured in these great little, not little, but these great spaces on our landscape. So why should we care, really? What does it matter? Because shell middens actually contain the story, not just of all these great data sets, but the story of the diverse heritage of Maine. For example, the indigenous heritage of Maine is well represented in shell middens in terms of life in Maine prior to European contact, right? There are 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine currently, and as a member of Penobscot Nation, I consider myself a descendant of the folks who made these great shell middens. They're Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot are all intimately connected to these spaces. And one of the reasons is because it's an opportunity for us to reconnect to a heritage that that was truncated, right, for, through European contact. And so I think in terms of indigenous peoples, it really gives us an opportunity to look at the choices and decisions and actions of people who shaped who we are today, right? And so that, for me, is really important. It also, the shell midden research also gives us kind of an opportunity to confront the historic erasure that happens in terms of indigenous lifeways here in the state. You know, we see a lot of emphasis often on the Blaine House and the Lighthouse, but shell middens just really don't get that aren't that celebrated, right? And so through this research, communities, the Wabanaki communities, become visible. And that's really important, not only for us, but for others who live in Maine to understand kind of how diverse our state really is. Additionally, one of the things that we can learn from shell middens is we hear an awful lot about traditional ecological knowledge, right? And how people lived on the land and had these approaches to the world that were probably a little more sustainable than what we are experiencing today. But I think there might be a sense of traditional anthropological knowledge as well, right? How do we behave as humans with each other, right? So all in all, I think in terms of the indigenous heritage piece, it's really important. It's an important piece of Maine, and the research on these sites helps to make that a little more visible. We also see evidence of this kind of settler heritage, right? These items are from Machias Bay, a site, the Holmes Point West site. One is a Saint Onge pot, which is actually from France. It dates to the 1600s. And the other is an English chamber pot. We don't know where the bottom went to it, but it's probably just as well, right? And that's English in origin. The neat thing about these is that they were distributed in different parts of the site, but there was also an indigenous component to that site as well. So what you have here is a neat and very informative space where you see indigenous and non-indigenous lifeways in that time when cultures came into contact, right? And so perhaps these folks, English or European folks, got along well with folks who were there, you know, and there was some sort of shared space at the site. Maybe there was some sort of land grab that we don't know about. So having this kind of history of multiple cultures coming together in a physical space is really important in terms of us understanding how people related back then, but also kind of sets the stage for who we are and how we relate today, right? And then it's not just those. We have this whole post-colonial heritage that is represented in shell middens, and this one in particular is Malaga Island, which is located on the New Meadows River in Phippsburg, Maine. And what this is it has both pre-contact and post-contact occupations, and it was home to a mixed heritage community, which Native American, African American, Irish American, Portuguese American, all folks who were kind of marginalized at the time, squatted on this parcel of land. And when they did, they harvested clams. And so here is evidence of, a shell midden that is behind one of the houses of these folks. And you can see that it it represents a different kind of engagement with clams, but you still get that same kind of archaeological visibility, right? Well, it turns out that the folks living here were evicted from the island in 1912, I believe, yep. And 8 of the residents were sent to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. All of the graves were excavated and put at the Maine School of the Feeble-Minded as well. And so all of the structures were demolished. And so this right here, that's the only record, right? In addition to newspaper articles or any kind of political documents that might be out there regarding this community. So when we think of shell middens, I think the point here is that they're not just kind of indigenous middens, although that's really important and we should celebrate that, but it's everybody's heritage, right? These shell middens represent all of us in some way, shape, or form as people living in Maine. But there's a problem, as Alice said, right? We're experiencing some real problems in terms of erosion, and you can see here what happens is the sea comes in and it'll undercut trees and vegetation, and then they slump, and then you lose all of the information that we're hoping to retain, right? We're hoping to learn from. And so erosion is just one problem. Another problem is mining and development, right? This here is the whaleback midden. In 1886, they embarked on a commercial venture to mine this midden. So they took barrels of shell, shipped it off to Boston for chicken feed and as a road base. And so with that went all kinds of history and paleoenvironmental data, just because people wanted to make a buck. They got, I think it was 30 cents for 200 ton or something like that. It was just really quite a, I think I do have the exact, yeah, 200 tons of shell at 30 cents per ton. So they actually had an archaeologist from the Harvard Peabody monitor that mining, and so when they were doing that work, they would pull out artifacts. So there is a collection, but there's no context to that. You know, there's no context to any of those materials, so we're unable to reconstruct as we would have been able to do archaeologically. This photo here shows development. This is a photo, this new construction built on a shell midden. They're still being threatened by development, and our behavior hasn't changed all that much, I guess is the point. Looting is another problem that we find. Very often looting is done in sometimes looting is actually people will go in unprofessional and dig out artifacts out of the site. And so what happens to material culture, they go into frames and go on the walls. Sometimes they'll go into shoe boxes and wind up in the attic. Sometimes, you know, there's an antiquities market and people will try and sell them. I was at a federal law enforcement session, several years ago, and this selling of antiquities has been linked to heavy drug users. So people, in order to get some money to kind of satisfy their drug habit, they'll loot archaeological sites. And so it's really a threat to the heritage and the information and data sets that these spaces encompass. So thank you. I'm going to switch it back to Alice now.
So we have these problems of development, not so much mining at this point, but these are viewed as,
Oh,
sorry. They're they're viewed as private property. If it's not held by a conservation organization or not held by as part of a state park, it's private property and it's open for development, or collecting, as some people would call it, looting would be the other. But the real problem facing the largest part of these shell middens is, of course, sea level rise. We know the climate is changing. We're dealing with sea level rise. Various projections have been made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looking at a variety of scenarios, the highest being a 6 foot or a 6 meter rise, 20 meter, excuse me, rise in sea, 6 foot, 2 meters rise at the most extreme. But what we have been observing, or what geologists have been observing, is that our current rise is going with that highest projection. So what we can imagine is that as this is happening, as storms are intensifying, as they're bringing those strong storm-driven waves higher and higher against the coast, we're going to see increased and more rapid erosion of these sites. Now that's the one that really catches people's attention, particularly if they live on the coast. They see this erosion taking place. But there's something that's just a little bit more insidious, but also damaging, is that our temperatures, our annual temperatures are warming. And as a result, we're seeing much more freeze-thaw activity. I mean, we're experiencing that right now. We get snow, then we get rain, then it warms, then we get snow, then we get rain. The cycle continues. Each time it thaws, water begins to move through that porous shell material, and then it freezes, it expands, it thaws again, and then moves through. And as this freeze-thaw takes place, we're physically moving parts of that midden away from the front in flakes and in clumps. And so that's going on in the background. We're imposing sea level rise, storm-driven waves on the front. So if you think about this kind of activity, it would be very much like if we had a bulldozer or a backhoe sitting right out here at Fogler, and every so often taking off just a little bit. Now, if that were happening, we would do something about it. Right? We would band together, there'd be committees, there'd be action, there'd be picketing, but nothing's really happening here, or it is, in fact, but it's happening much more quietly. And we're hoping to change that a bit. So this project started with a Sea Grant funded investigation called Lost to the Sea, Maine's Ancient Coastal Heritage. And what we were looking here was just to try and get a handle on this project. We were looking at site characterization. Could we prioritize sites for investigation? Could we understand something about shoreline change? And that was kind of the sciencey part. But then there was the human dimension. And what we wanted to do was to develop some idea of stakeholder involvement in this issue. And then could we develop a way to hold information that was developed in a way that it could be used for the future? Sciencey part, using geophysics as a way to rapidly delineate the size and thickness of shell middens. If you're counting on time and labor intensive archaeological sites to tell you what the extent of a site is, you're only going to be able to look at 2 to 3 sites per year. That's what's happening now. But by using some geophysics, not excavating sites, we were able to create maps showing the extent and the thickness of sites, something like this isopac map of one of our mid-coastal sites. The other part was developing a stakeholder organization. And so we started with a facilitated meeting, bringing together representatives of conservation groups, historical societies, state agencies, researchers from universities, tribal representatives, and some avocational archaeologists as well. We had a field trip and a meeting and came to the conclusion that yes, this is an issue and we need to do something about it. We no longer want to rely on anecdotal evidence, which was the situation we were at before. So what we've developed is the Maine Midden Minders Network, which is a citizen science organization or program designed to monitor the erosion of Maine's coastal shell middens. And this is where the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions comes in, as they're supporting our work in developing this monitoring and training protocol for use by conservation organizations. We also are continuing to work with Sea Grant, and with that we're doing the above label work, and we're building a website that's going to go live later this spring for use by individual Midden Minders, people who may live near a site, own a site. These are quite common on summer properties on the coast, so that they can also become part of our monitoring effort. And part of that is how to hold this information, and that process is being led by the Advanced Computing Group here at UMaine, which is developing a website that protects the landowner privacy and the land privacy, so that unlike most citizen science networks where everything is shared amongst everyone, someone who's interested in collecting or looting at one of these sites won't be able to go onto the website and find the location of our various Maine middens. So our partners in this effort, the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Acadia National Park, the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy Tribes, College of the Atlantic, the Damascotta River Association, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We're currently putting together 3 training programs in 3 different parts of the state. That the Damascotta River Association will be hosting one in the Mid-Coast area. Acadia National Park is involved in a training session in the Frenchman's Bay area, and I just heard today that the Frenchman's Bay Conservancy is interested in participating, so that's great news for the day. And then also working at the Long Point and Sip Bay Preserves down East Maine, Washington County, supported by Maine Coast Heritage Trust. So this is what our field work looks like. We spent a fair amount of time last summer in the field doing some baseline surveys, getting ideas of midden size, their condition, and developing specific monitoring plans for our partners. The database and website development began. Right now we're continuing with those efforts. And next summer we have our kickoff of our monitoring program. We go live with our training sessions and our website, and we start contributing information to that database. So I would like to encourage anyone who is interested in coastal shell middens, here's the unadulterated plug, to get in touch. There are shell middens everywhere along the coast, 2,000 of them. So become an individual midden minder, or join with one of the conservation groups, or talk to your favorite conservation group about participating, and you can get in touch with me here. We will soon have our very own email, and so that's exciting. We used a lot of scientific work in this effort. Here are our references, and at this point I would be happy to take questions, and I'm sure Bonnie would as well.
Plenty of time.
Yes.
Thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. I'm curious, so you talked about protecting the privacy of landowners and protecting these sites from people who would go there, from youth or collect. How are you thinking about how to share what you learn so that it doesn't just stay crafted in the database?
Yeah, and that was the part I cut out, but thank you for asking that question. What we're doing is this will be open to the conservation associations, so that whoever is our contact there, typically it's the education or volunteer manager, will have access to everything. Well, they will have access to the database, but specifically for their area. Individual people will be able to see what they put in previous years. So they'll see a record of how their location has been changing. On a broader scale, The Maine Historic Preservation Commission is tied to this effort. In fact, it could not have happened without their support. They will, of course, have access to this. And researchers who are working on middens or working on coastal erosion can apply through either us or the Historic Preservation Commission to have access to the data. So really what we want the information to be out, and certainly it can be useful in prioritizing where scarce resources can be focused. But we don't want to identify a specific location on a map. As I said, many of these are privately held, and people want to enjoy their summer cottage without folks just walking over their property.
There's an interesting tension there, and I'm wondering how much discussion you guys had with your group about it. It seems to me there would have to be quite a bit, and I don't disagree with keeping the knowledge secure at all, but by starting your talk by talking about places like Blaine House, Lighthouses, and trying to get buy-in from the larger state community, whatever, that sort of cultural resource heritage sites or whatever, by kind of keeping them secret, that creates a tension then that you don't have it. Let people know where they are, because part of like lighthouses is they're visible, they're on the landscape, there's something you can see. So I'm wondering, how are you folks navigating that tension of trying to create that sense of cultural heritage resource site you refer to that, but at the same time keeping that knowledge secure?
There absolutely is a tension. You could not get individual buy-in if you told them that this was going to be widely available. People are very protective of their private property. However, there are locations that are public. The Whaleback Midden, the Glidden Midden, and conservation associations have these sites and can use them as living laboratories, so to speak, example sites of what is going on. There is some discussion with the Damascotta River Association of putting some wayside exhibits in. A whole other part is a recreation of what it would have looked like to canoe up the Damascotta River 2,000 years ago. Vini, the lab here on campus, did one of that recreation for us. They're going to be showing that in their education facility at Round Pond, or at Round Top. So we can use the ones that are publicly accessible as the examples. When we write a scientific article, we locate these sites, but with a very big dot. And that's how we get around the local issue.
Some of the way in the city will be
Yeah, it's just, a nice big dot. It gives you an idea that it's mid-coast, southern coast, down east, but it doesn't tell you driving directions to somebody's front yard.
I think it's an ongoing tension in archaeology in general. You want to do this public education about these wonderful spaces, but then you have to protect them. So oftentimes it comes down to kind of an individual decision about that particular space. Perhaps there are tribal interests that would warrant not revealing certain spaces, or maybe there are places that have better methods or mechanisms in place to kind of keep watch. So I think it really is something we struggle with as archaeologists all the time.
I would say, just to add to that, is for a very long time archaeologists did not want to let people know where sites were,
Yeah.
and most of it was the looting issue. Some colleagues in Scotland, and in fact Europe is decades ahead of us with this idea, and I'm following many of their ideas. What they found was that the local people all know where it is.
Yeah.
The issue is the people who are the visitors, and for us it's the summer visitors who are looking for a day out with a shovel. And in Scotland, by bringing this to the local people, including them as monitors, including them in rescue excavations, bringing them into the idea they become the strongest advocates for protection. And so we're hoping that we can develop a bit of that ethos here in Maine as well.
On one of your slides, you had the word priority, prioritization.
Yeah.
I was wondering, from what you've done so far, do you get a sense of some sites that, how do you measure that? How do you measure, why are some sites in your mind more important than others? Is it because of their sheer size, like living a whaleback, or is it because of erosion?
Well, what we've talked about, I think, is looking at what they can tell us is as a piece of it, but also which ones are most threatened. In terms of, we know down east area is particularly threatened from sea level rise, and so a lot of our energy has been directed to sites down that way. But really, it does come down to what can it tell us, right? And how, what are the impacts on a particular site?
Has working with people shifted that priority?
I think
Do some sites become more important than what you thought?
I think, there are, when community engagement or stakeholders are involved, I would say, and Alice, you may want to speak to this, but I would say yes, that it tends to drive your energy, just like money, right? Tends to drive kind of where you focus your energies. And so while ideally we as archaeologists may have this plan in our mind, all of these other factors play in terms of making those decisions about where to focus our energies.
And I think just from the geological aspect, all we have right now is anecdotal data. So someone can say, oh, this storm took a meter off the front of this site. But there's nothing in print anywhere. It's just, it might be an email, maybe a picture, that's it. If you're trying to gain funding for rescue excavations or looking at sites, very few granting agencies are going to accept anecdotal information. And so what we're hoping to be able to do, and this will take a few years, we're running against the clock, but to be able to look at these sites and be able to look at the orientation, the fetch, what is the wave state like? Can we make some physical measurements that will tell us this sort of storm will have the most effect on these areas, or the oldest sites tend to be in these locations for these reasons, and to be able to quantify that to help get support for doing the kind of work that people would like to do on the coast.
Are there things that you can find out about the life? For instance, can you tell by looking at a midden from the way it feels, or that whether the shells were cooked or eaten raw? And is it something where you can figure that this midden was only shells mostly, and there was another place where other stuff that had to get thrown out was put, or was it all one big? Can you find things that way?
As far as the cooked question, that I can't answer. I'm not sure. I don't think we can tell. But in terms of kind of the social space around the middens, you will find areas where there's middens, and then there are spaces without middens. You may have layers of middens and spaces without middens. You have to remember that all species have this kind of garbaging behavior, right? And so they clear out space where they do their activities. And so that happens with humans as well. And I think the key is to excavate in a way you can kind of get that picture and see some of these non-shell versus shell spaces and begin to piece together kind of the behavior or what folks were doing in that space.
Well, and one of the results of the ground penetrating radar studies was that we can see some of that, not cooked versus uncooked, but we can see a bit of the distribution, particularly of thick shell layers and potentially house structure or house floors. So that means that when someone like Bonnie is going to work at one of these sites, we can offer some suggestions about where she might want to focus that labor on that site rather than spreading it out.
My sense on the cooked versus uncooked is that they were probably cooked. It's much easier to get into them, you know, if they're cooked as opposed to not being cooked. So that's just, yes.
I have a question, sort of in reference to what you were talking about before. Have you thought of documenting in sort of a time-lapse fashion the coastline, especially on one of the shell middens that you have more access to create basically a time-lapse like how they did Chasing Ice, the film about the glaciers where you could actually see.
Part of this is having people taking measurements, so we'll be creating maps. For the large middens, we're going to be using drones.
Okay.
And
But
so
will you be doing it at regular intervals so that you can build?
the idea is that the time when most of the big changes happen on these middens is through the winter. Fall, through the winter, and into the big spring coastal storms like the Patriots Day storm. That's very conveniently when people tend to want to come and visit the coast, is right after those things happen in the spring and summer. And so the big push will be to do documentation through in the early summer, using those photographs. The other thing is that you can take amazing pictures with a cell phone, and you can, in fact, if as it's set up, you can even do 3D images from those cell phone pictures, so that we can create a series of images to document the changes. And on some of them, it may be hard to take the physical measurements from the top, so those images will really be useful. So that, and then the other part is what is coming out, asking people to routinely walk the front of the midden to at least take pictures of things that they may see, faunal remains, artifacts of the sort. So the website has a place for images. We're working with a graduate student in Earth and Climate Sciences on the 3D structure for motion side of things.
Here in Maine, we have a site record that the state maintains, and very often those records will include information on site size, and sometimes you'll look at one of those site records, you'll go back to the site and it won't be there anymore. And so the key is getting back to them routinely so that you can kind of monitor how fast they're eroding.
That's where you come in.
Yeah.
Maybe one last question. I realize we're running a little bit late, so please go ahead.
Thanks for your great talk. I just wanted to jump off of the earlier questions about the stakeholder interest. So once you have a sort of a network built and vested stakeholders in the sites that are being mined, will you also allow them to be involved in the decision making of which sites you will be working on, to address their priority? Because people will have, imagine people have interest in certain areas because of their geographic location or cultural reasons. So I was just wondering.
I think that's absolutely what I'm expecting is going to come out of particularly working with conservation organizations. Some of them don't even know what they had.
Sure.
And are quite interested in helping to do this. So rather than being only a university or a state historic preservation commission project, I'm envisioning a lot of these are going to be joint projects.
Yeah, I would envision kind of a more robust community engagement, stakeholder engagement process. Once we get this Midden Minder up and running and in a way that's efficient, I think we will begin to get some of those inputs, which is really important. We want the public to be supportive of our work here at the University of Maine, and I think that's one way to do that.
So I bet this conversation could continue, and if you have time to hang around, please stay. But let's break here and thank Alice and
Thank you.
Bonnie for bringing us.